There's a photograph sitting on a fireplace mantel in Columbus, Ohio. In it, a man and a woman are standing in an airport arrivals hall, and they are crying. Not the kind of crying people try to hide. The kind that takes over your whole face. The kind that happens when something you have waited for so long that you stopped believing it would ever come finally arrives. The man's name is Tom Mercer. The woman's name is Karen Mercer. And the small girl in Karen's arms, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one button eye missing, is the reason this story exists. Her name, on the documents the agency gave them, was Lena. That photograph was taken in the spring of 2011. And for 6 years, the Mercers kept it right there on that mantel, because to them, it was the best day of their lives. What they did not know, standing in that arrivals hall with tears on their faces and joy in their chests, was that the agency that placed Lena in their arms was built on a foundation of lies so deep, so deliberate, and so far-reaching that by the time the full truth came out, it would reach the halls of Congress, trigger a federal investigation spanning 3 continents, and shatter the lives of dozens of families who had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong people with the most important decision of their lives. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, a woman named Petra had been searching for her daughter for 6 years. She had never stopped. She had never given up. And she had absolutely no idea that her little girl was growing up in Columbus, Ohio, calling someone else mom. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming video. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the investigation, not the beginning of the fraud, but the beginning of Tom and Karen Mercer. Because this story is not just about an agency that broke the law. It is about 2 good people who wanted to do the right thing and were turned into instruments of someone else's crime without ever knowing it. Tom Mercer grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a factory foreman and a school librarian. He went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied civil engineering, came back home, started a small construction company, and built it into something respectable over 20 years of hard, quiet work. He was the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late. The kind of man whose handshake meant something in every room he walked into. He coached youth baseball for 9 seasons. His players called him Coach Tom. That is the kind of man Tom Mercer was. Karen Mercer, born Karen Whitfield, was a middle school art teacher at a school in Columbus where she had been teaching for 14 years by the time this story begins. She kept a jar of colored pencils on her desk and a poster on her classroom wall that read, "Every child deserves to be seen." She believed that with the conviction of someone who had looked at children for a living long enough to understand what happened when nobody was looking back. Karen and Tom met at a church social when they were both 27 years old. They were married 11 months later, and from almost the very beginning of their marriage, they talked about having children. What they did not talk about, not at first, not to anyone outside the 2 of them, was how hard that turned out to be. Between 2001 and 2007, Karen went through 4 rounds of fertility treatment. Each one failed. There were 2 miscarriages. The second one was late enough that Tom and Karen had already chosen a name. Tom has never said the name publicly. He has only said that it was his mother's name, and that after that second loss, something in the house went quiet in a way that took a long time to lift. The kind of quiet that settles into the corners of rooms and doesn't move until you make a deliberate decision to move it yourself. It was Karen who first brought up international adoption. Not as a consolation, she was very clear about that when she spoke to friends. As a calling. She had spent enough years watching children who needed to be seen to believe, genuinely and completely, that somewhere in the world there was a child who needed her specifically. She was right. There was such a child. She just could not have imagined what it had taken to place that child in her path. Tom and Karen began researching adoption agencies in 2008. There were more options than they had expected. Domestic agencies, international agencies, private facilitators, faith-based programs. They attended informational sessions. They read forums and message boards and talked to families who had been through the process. 3 families at their church had adopted internationally and were, by all appearances, thriving. One of those families pointed them toward an agency called Bright Horizons International Placement Services, based in Atlanta, Georgia. It had been in operation since the early 1990s. It had placed over 2,000 children in American homes. It had a professional website, a glossy brochure, framed certificates in its lobby, and a waiting room with motivational quotes painted on the walls. It had a soft-spoken woman at the front desk who called every prospective parent honey. It had, as far as Tom and Karen could tell, an impeccable reputation. What it also had was Richard Doyle. Richard Doyle was the executive director of Bright Horizons International Placement Services. He was 61 years old, a former social worker with a calm, measured manner that made him seem like exactly the kind of man who should be entrusted with something this important. He wore cardigans and spoke in the careful, deliberate rhythm of a person who had spent decades being the most composed person in emotionally charged rooms. His office walls were covered in framed photographs of children and families, hundreds of placements, dozens of countries, a visual testimony to a lifetime of supposedly good work. When Tom and Karen first sat across from him in that office and told him why they were there, Richard Doyle nodded slowly, clasped his hands on the desk in front of him, and said, "We are going to find you your child." Tom said later that in that moment, he felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for 7 years. He trusted Richard Doyle completely. That trust would become the most expensive thing Tom Mercer ever gave away. The Mercers began the adoption process in the fall of 2008. What followed was not fast or simple. International adoption never is. There was a home study requiring a licensed social worker to visit their house, interview them separately and together, examine their finances, their health records, their backgrounds, their references. There was a stack of federal paperwork so thick Karen joked that it weighed more than she did. There was a dossier that had to be translated, notarized, authenticated, and submitted to the country of origin. For the Mercers, Richard Doyle had recommended Eastern Europe. He told them Bright Horizons had deep, trusted relationships with welfare offices and partner facilities in the region. He told them the documentation standards were rigorous and the process transparent. He told them the timeline would be between 18 months and 2 years. He told them a great many things over the following months. Almost none of what he told them about the origins of the children in his program was true. What was happening in certain parts of Eastern Europe in the late 2000s and early 2010s mirrored a problem that investigators were simultaneously uncovering in Africa and Central America. A problem that the international adoption industry had created through its own unchecked demand. The number of families in wealthy Western nations willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars to adopt a child far outpaced the number of children who were genuinely available for international adoption. True orphans, children with no living relatives and no family capable of caring for them, were far less common than the agencies needed them to be in order to sustain their business model. And so certain individuals, both inside the agencies and in the countries where the children were found, developed methods to close that gap. Some of those methods involved paperwork. Some involved money changing hands in offices where decisions about children's futures were made. And some involved finding mothers in desperate circumstances and lying to them about what they were signing. Petra was 22 years old in 2010, living in a small city in Eastern Europe with her 4-year-old daughter, Anna, and no safety net. She had separated from Anna's father the previous year. She was working inconsistent cleaning jobs and struggling to hold on to her apartment. She was not, by any measure, a woman who had abandoned her child or had no interest in her child's welfare. She was a young mother in a difficult situation who made one catastrophic mistake. She answered an ad posted by a local organization that claimed to offer temporary support placements for children whose parents were going through financial hardship. The ad described a short-term foster arrangement, 60 to 90 days, during which the parent could stabilize their situation while the child was cared for in a safe, supervised environment. Petra went to the office. She filled out forms. She was told the arrangement was temporary. She was told she could visit. She was told Anna would come back to her. She signed the paperwork that was placed in front of her, trusting that it said what she had been told it said. It did not. What Petra had signed, through a chain of documentation that moved with practiced speed from that local office, to a regional welfare authority, to a file on Richard Doyle's desk in Atlanta, Georgia, was a consent form that had been deliberately formatted to obscure its actual function. By the time it reached Bright Horizons, it had been translated, reinterpreted, and restructured into what legally appeared to be a voluntary relinquishment for international adoption. Anna's file was created. Her name was changed. Her family history was listed as unknown. Her mother was listed as a woman who had voluntarily and permanently surrendered all parental rights. The psychological assessment in the file, describing Anna as a child with no stable attachment history, no traceable family connections, and no contraindications for international placement, had been written by a clinician whose name later appeared in a federal investigation, and who, authorities confirmed, had never once met the child she was writing about. When Petra returned to retrieve her daughter 60 days after the placement, she was told that the case had been transferred to a different authority and that the records were sealed. She was told to wait. She waited. She was told to come back. She came back. She was told her paperwork was insufficient. She brought more paperwork. At every turn, there was another wall, another delay, another form, another closed door. It took Petra 18 months to find someone willing to tell her, plainly and directly, that her daughter had been placed with an international adoption agency. It took her another year to learn that the agency was American. And it took her 3 more years of letters to government offices, conversations with journalists, contact with advocacy organizations, and an increasingly desperate search through every channel available to her, to find a social worker named Marta Varga who was willing to take her case seriously. Marta Varga was a child welfare investigator who had spent 6 years working with families in Eastern Europe, attempting to navigate the consequences of international adoption placements gone wrong. By 2014, Marta had built a detailed working knowledge of the methods used by certain agencies to manufacture the legal appearance of adoptability in children who were not actually available for adoption. She had documented multiple cases involving the same patterns: recruitment of financially vulnerable mothers, deceptive documentation, falsified welfare assessments, and children whose legal identities had been reconstructed from the ground up in ways that made them impossible to trace unless you knew exactly where to look. When Petra came to her, Marta recognized the signature immediately. She had seen it before. She had seen it in cases connected to more than one American agency. And she had been collecting evidence long enough to know that what she was looking at with Bright Horizons was not the work of one careless employee making isolated mistakes. It was a system, and Richard Doyle had built it. Meanwhile, in Columbus, Ohio, Tom and Karen Mercer were living a life they had not dared to fully imagine 6 years earlier. Lena had come home in April 2011, a quiet, watchful 4-year-old who studied the Mercers with serious eyes for several days before she decided, apparently on her own schedule and nobody else's, that she would let them in. Karen described the moment she first heard Lena laugh, really laugh, not the careful, testing smile she had been offering since her arrival, as one of the most purely happy sounds she had ever been in the same room with. Tom said that the first time Lena fell asleep on his shoulder during a car ride back from the grocery store, he drove around the block 3 extra times so she could stay asleep longer. That is the kind of father Tom Mercer was. By the time Lena was 7, she had developed a fierce love of birds. By 9, she had moved on to marine animals and was drawing elaborate underwater scenes on every available surface in the house, including twice on the kitchen wall, which Karen repainted and then quietly framed the second time because she could not bring herself to paint over it. By 10, Lena had announced that she intended to be a marine biologist because nobody had found everything at the bottom of the ocean yet, and she wanted to be the one to find it. Tom told her he believed her completely. Karen said she had better start with the kitchen wall. Lena was, by every measure that Tom and Karen could see, thriving. She was happy. She was loved. She was exactly where she belonged. And there was one thing, one small, persistent thing that occasionally surfaced in the quiet moments before sleep, the way small things do, that Karen had never fully been able to explain away. When Lena first came home, she sometimes cried at night, not loudly, almost silently. Karen would go to her room and find her awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and when Karen asked her what was wrong, Lena would say, "I was remembering a voice." Just that, a voice. Karen had assumed it was the voice of a caregiver at the facility where Lena had spent her first months in the agency's care, someone who had been kind to her, someone she missed. She had never once imagined it was the voice of a 22-year-old woman in Eastern Europe who had gone back to a closed office door and been turned away, and had spent the 6 years since trying to find her way back to the daughter she had never willingly given up. The call that changed everything came in the spring of 2017. It did not come directly to the Mercers at first. It came through a channel that Marta Varga had spent 3 years constructing with the precision of someone who understood that one procedural misstep could collapse everything she had built. Marta had made contact with a diplomatic liaison at the U.S. Embassy who had forwarded her documented findings to federal investigators in the United States. Those investigators had been simultaneously developing their own case against Bright Horizons, a case built on many of the same patterns Marta had identified, but approached from the American end of the pipeline rather than the European one. When Marta's evidence arrived, it filled in critical gaps. It gave investigators not just the system, but the specific cases. It gave them names. It gave them Petra. And it gave them Lena. A victim's advocate from the U.S. Attorney's Office drove to Columbus in the spring of 2017 with a federal investigator. They came on a Wednesday morning while Lena was at school. Tom said he knew from the moment he opened the door and saw 2 people in dark coats standing on his porch at 9 in the morning that something in the world had shifted. He just did not know yet in which direction. Karen made coffee. She has said she made the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, because her hands already knew something her mind was still catching up to. They all sat down in the living room. The investigators were careful. They were kind. They told Tom and Karen everything they knew, and it took about 2 hours. And by the end of it, the world that Tom and Karen had been living in for 6 years looked exactly the same from the outside and completely different from the inside. The core of what the investigators told them was this: the file that Richard Doyle's agency had prepared on Lena, the file describing her as an orphan with no surviving family, no traceable history, no living relatives, was fabricated. Her name had not originally been Lena. It had been Anna. Her mother was a woman named Petra. Petra was alive. She had not consented to an international adoption. She had signed a document under false pretenses, believing she was arranging a temporary placement, and that document had been converted by the agency into the first legal link in a chain that ended in Columbus, Ohio. Petra had been trying to find Anna for 6 years. She was still trying, and she had never, not for a single day in 6 years, stopped. Tom Mercer has said that the silence in his living room after the investigators finished speaking was the longest silence he has ever lived inside. He could hear the clock on the kitchen wall. He could hear the refrigerator. He looked at the photograph on the fireplace mantel, Tom and Karen in the airport, crying, Lena in Karen's arms with the stuffed rabbit, and he felt something move through his chest that he has never been able to name precisely. It was not guilt, he has said, because he had done nothing wrong. He and Karen had followed every rule, filled out every form, trusted every verification, paid every fee in good faith. It was something more specific than guilt and more complicated than grief. It was the feeling of discovering that the ground you had built your life on was never as solid as you had been told. Karen's response was different from Tom's and entirely in keeping with who Karen Mercer is. Tom said that within about an hour of the investigators leaving, Karen was at the kitchen table with her laptop, researching, not falling apart, working, looking up family reunification organizations, looking up what Petra's legal rights were under international family law, looking up what Lena's rights were, looking up what the Mercers' rights were, looking up every organization that had ever helped a family in a situation like this find their way to something that resembled wholeness. Tom said watching her do that was the moment he understood, after 20 years of marriage, the full depth of what Karen Mercer was made of. What came next for the Mercer family over the following months had no template, because almost no family had been through exactly this before and come out the other side with a map they could hand to someone else. They worked with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and attachment. They made the decision, not quickly, not without pain, not without sitting in uncertainty for weeks that felt like months, to tell Lena the truth. Lena was 11 years old when Tom and Karen sat her down at the kitchen table one Saturday morning and explained that her story had a chapter before the chapter they knew. That there was a woman who had loved her and had been deceived and had never stopped looking for her. That her name had once been Anna, and that a woman named Petra had signed a form believing she would see her daughter again in 60 days, and had been lied to. Lena sat through the entire conversation without speaking. When Tom and Karen finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked one question. She asked, "Does she know I'm okay?" Karen said they were going to make sure she knew. Lena nodded. She went to her room. She was quiet for a long time. When she came out for dinner, she asked Tom if he would help her write a letter. He said yes before she finished asking. The federal investigation had been moving forward on its own timeline, regardless of what was happening in the Mercer household. Richard Doyle had been located. He had not fled the country, as some investigators had briefly feared. He had been staying with a relative in another state, apparently operating on the belief that the problem would somehow resolve itself without his direct involvement. That is not a strategy that tends to work well against a federal indictment. Doyle was arrested and charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, wire fraud, and violations of federal law governing international adoption practices. He was charged with knowingly directing the submission of falsified documentation to the U.S. State Department, with overseeing a bribery scheme that involved payments to foreign welfare officials in exchange for fraudulent approvals, and with deliberately concealing the true circumstances of the children in his program from the American families who adopted them. The indictment against Richard Doyle, when it was unsealed, laid out a picture that was more systematic and more calculated than even the investigators' initial findings had suggested. Bright Horizons International Placement Services had not stumbled into fraud through carelessness. The fraud was the architecture. Over more than 15 years of operation, the agency had placed children in American homes from Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, and Central America. Not every placement was fraudulent. Investigators were careful to make that distinction from the beginning, both for accuracy and to avoid causing unnecessary panic among the thousands of American families who had adopted through Bright Horizons and were now frightened about what any of this meant for them. But a significant number of cases, investigators identified more than 60, and believed the actual number was higher, involved children who had been obtained through deliberate deception of their biological families, falsified legal documentation, or the direct payment of bribes to foreign officials whose job was supposed to be protecting those children. During Richard Doyle's prosecution, one piece of testimony emerged that went beyond the mechanics of the fraud and into something more troubling about the agency's deliberate choices. When Doyle eventually cooperated with federal investigators in an attempt to negotiate a reduced sentence, he admitted something that prosecutors had suspected but not fully documented. The agency had maintained an internal system for categorizing prospective adoptive families based not just on their eligibility, but on their usefulness to the agency's continued operations. Families with professional credentials, stable community ties, strong references, and visible positions in their communities were actively prioritized, not only because they were good candidates, but because successful placements with those families could be used as references and marketing material to recruit more adoptive families. Tom and Karen Mercer had been on that list. Tom's construction business, Karen's teaching career, their church community, their clean record, and their visible life in Columbus. They had been selected in part for their usefulness to a brand. They were not just parents. They were, to Richard Doyle, a sales tool. Tom Mercer has spoken about that revelation only once, in a brief interview conducted in 2019. He said that of all the things he learned about what Richard Doyle had done, that particular piece, the coldness of it, the calculation of it, the way Doyle had looked at two people who had handed him their deepest vulnerability and seen an asset to be leveraged, was the one that kept him awake the longest. He said it made him question not just Doyle but the entire industry, the entire framework of oversight and accreditation and trust that was supposed to prevent exactly this from happening. He said, "We did everything right. We checked everything they told us to check. We trusted the system because the system is what you trust when you don't know what else to trust. and the system was what let this happen. That is not a comfortable thing to know, but he said it is better to know it than not to. Richard Doyle pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Other co-conspirators in the case received sentences ranging from probation with community service to several years of incarceration, depending on their level of involvement and their cooperation with investigators. The foreign officials who had accepted payment in exchange for fraudulent approvals were pursued through diplomatic channels and faced legal proceedings in their own jurisdictions. Bright Horizons International Placement Services lost its accreditation permanently. The State Department debarred it from any further operation. The building in Atlanta was eventually sold. The photographs of children and families that had covered Richard Doyle's office walls were removed, and what happened to them is not recorded anywhere in the public documentation of the case, which seems like an appropriate ending for objects that were always more about appearances than about truth. For the families on both ends of the Bright Horizons pipeline, the American families who had adopted and the overseas biological families who had been deceived, the legal resolution was not a conclusion. It was a pivot point. The government had done what it could do. Now the human beings involved had to figure out what came next, and there was no procedure for that and no map. For some adoptive families, the news that their child had a living biological parent overseas arrived like an earthquake, reorganizing everything without warning. There were children who responded with fear and confusion. There were parents who struggled to hold their families together while cooperating with investigators and processing a betrayal so layered that it is difficult to hold in a single thought. There were strained marriages and sleepless years and mental health crises that played out quietly in houses where the neighbors had no idea anything had changed. The Mercers were not exempt from any of that. Tom has described the period between 2017 and 2019 as the most difficult stretch of his adult life, harder, in certain ways, than the fertility years, because at least the fertility years were a grief with a clear location. This was grief mixed with anger mixed with the strange, disorienting work of holding two true things at the same time. Lena was their daughter. Completely, permanently, without question. And Lena had been taken from a woman who loved her by people who had treated her as inventory. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and both of them had to be lived with simultaneously, and that is not a simple place to stand. Tom has said that the only thing that kept him oriented during those years was looking at Lena and remembering that she had not done anything to deserve any of this, and that whatever Tom felt, she was feeling it too, and she was 11 years old, and she needed him to hold it together. So he held it together. Marta Varga, whose investigation and testimony had been instrumental in building the case against Richard Doyle, also played a role in the next chapter of the story that had nothing to do with courts or prosecutors. Marta had maintained contact with Petra throughout the investigation. She had been the person who, 3 years earlier, had first told Petra that her daughter was alive and in an American home. She had been the person who sat with Petra through the long months of waiting while the legal machinery turned. And she was the person who, in the fall of 2017, helped facilitate the first written contact between Petra and the Mercer family. The letter came through an intermediary, carefully translated, carefully worded, not demanding, not accusatory, but asking one thing: is she safe? Is my daughter safe? Tom read the letter alone first. Then he gave it to Karen. Then they read it together again. Then Tom went upstairs and knocked on Lena's door. The Mercers, together and deliberately, made a decision that cost them nothing except the willingness to put Lena before everything else. They wrote back to Petra. Karen wrote most of the letter. She described Lena's love of birds and marine biology. She described the kitchen wall full of drawings. She described the stuffed rabbit Lena still kept on her bed. She told Petra that her daughter was healthy, loved, and remarkable. She told Petra that she was sorry for what had been done to her, and that no word in the English language was adequate for how sorry she was. And she told Petra that Lena knew now, and that when Lena was ready, they would not stand in the way of whatever connection Lena chose to build. That letter took Karen 3 days to write. She has said it is the most important thing she has ever put on paper. The first video call between Lena Mercer and Petra happened in February 2018. Lena was 12 years old. Petra was 34. They had not been in the same room or even in the same country since Lena was 4 years old and did not know what was happening to her. The call lasted 51 minutes, most of which involved a translator working at speed, and both parties crying and laughing in the way that people do when the feeling is too large for either emotion on its own. Petra had brought photographs, old ones from before, Lena in a yellow dress, Lena asleep on a small sofa, Lena at a table eating something that made her eyes go wide with happiness. Lena held the screen close and looked at each one for a long time without speaking. Tom and Karen sat just outside the frame for the whole call, visible only if you knew to look for them. When the call ended and Lena had gone to tell her collection of stuffed animals about what had just happened, which is exactly what Lena did, because that was who Lena was, Tom and Karen sat at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long time. Then Tom said, "We did the right thing." Karen said, "We did the only thing." They meant exactly the same thing by both. Petra has been asked, many times, by journalists and advocates and people who followed this story, whether she holds anger toward Tom and Karen Mercer. Her answer has been consistent, and it has been clear. Tom and Karen did not take her daughter, she has said. They were taken from two. Richard Doyle and the people who worked for him and the officials who accepted his money took her daughter and took 6 years from both of them. Tom and Karen Mercer are the people who, when they found out, wrote to her immediately, told her Lena was safe, and never once tried to use the law or the distance or the complexity of the situation as a reason to keep her from knowing her daughter. She has said that she considers the Mercers, in a way that has no clean name in any language she knows, to be part of her family. She says that when she looks at the photographs they send her now, Lena drawing at the kitchen table, Lena with her stuffed rabbit, Lena at the ocean on a school trip, standing at the edge of the water with her shoes off and her face turned toward the horizon. She feels something she did not believe she would ever feel again after those 6 years. She feels, finally, at rest. Lena Mercer is 16 years old now. She has kept her name. She calls Tom and Karen her parents. She has a photograph of Petra on her dresser, next to the stuffed rabbit with one button eye missing, the same one she was holding in the airport photograph on the fireplace mantel the day she came home. She writes to Petra regularly. She is in high school, still talking about marine biology, still wanting to be the person who finds the things nobody has found yet. She gave one brief interview to a journalist writing about international adoption reform, and in it, she said something that has stayed with people who heard it. She said she does not think of her story as a tragedy. She thinks of it as a complicated truth that she is still learning how to carry, and that carrying complicated truths is probably just what life is when you are paying attention. The system that allowed Richard Doyle to do what he did for 15 years without being stopped is not a comfortable thing to examine, but it has to be examined if any of this is going to mean something. The accreditation bodies responsible for overseeing adoption agencies relied in significant part on information provided by the agencies themselves. The home country welfare systems that approved the placements were, in certain regions, under-resourced, poorly supervised, and vulnerable to corruption at the individual official level in ways that were difficult to detect from the outside. The American families going through the process had no mechanism for independently verifying the origins of the children they were adopting. They were dependent entirely on the documentation the agency provided, which was precisely the documentation the agency was manufacturing. The oversight was, at too many points in the chain, self-reporting. And self-reporting is only as honest as the person holding the pen. There are families in the United States right now, families who adopted internationally in good faith, who went through every step of the process correctly, who love their children without reservation, who do not yet know that the files they were given were incomplete, falsified, or fabricated. Some of those children are still young. Some are adults building their own lives. For some, the truth, when it comes, will bring relief, the relief of an incomplete feeling finally having a name. For others, it will bring devastation. For most, it will bring both at once, layered in the way that only the hardest truths can be layered. And for all of them, the question of what to do with that truth will be the most important question they ever face. There is no universal right answer, but there is a template now. Tom and Karen Mercer built it in a house in Columbus, Ohio, at a kitchen table with their daughter on a Saturday morning when they chose to tell the truth even though they did not have to. Tom Mercer was asked recently whether he had any regrets. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I regret that Petra lost 6 years. I regret that Lena didn't know sooner that someone had been looking for her. I regret that Richard Doyle is sitting in a prison cell right now thinking about what he could have done differently to avoid getting caught rather than thinking about the actual harm he caused to actual people who trusted him. But am I sorry that Karen and I walked through that arrivals terminal and came home with our daughter?" He paused for a long time. Then he said, "No, I am not sorry for that. That little girl deserved to be loved, and we loved her, and we still love her. And nothing that Richard Doyle did and nothing that came after can touch that. That part is ours. It always was." Karen Mercer still teaches middle school art in Columbus. She still has the jar of colored pencils on her desk. She has a new poster on her wall now, one that Lena made for her when she was 13. It says, "Every child came from somewhere. Honor that." Karen says she looks at it every day when her students come in. She says it makes her a more careful teacher. It makes her ask more questions and listen more closely and pay more attention when a child goes quiet in a way she can't immediately explain. She says that if this whole experience gave her anything worth holding on to, it is that. Not the anger, not even the complicated grace of watching Lena and Petra find each other across everything that was put between them. Just the reminder that every child's story is bigger than what you can see from where you are standing. And that the most important thing you can do is make sure they know you are paying attention. The photograph is still on the fireplace mantel in the Mercer home in Columbus, Ohio. Tom and Karen in the airport, crying. Karen holding a small girl with a stuffed rabbit and one button eye missing. It is still the best day of their lives. It is also a more complicated day than it appeared to be in the moment of it. That is true of more days than we usually admit. And maybe that is the real question this story is asking us to carry out of here. Not just about the fraud. Not just about Richard Doyle. Not just about the names in the indictment or the years in the sentences or the files in the boxes the FBI carried out of those offices. But this, what do we owe each other when the truth is harder than the story we were told? What do we do when doing right by someone we love means making room for a pain we did not cause? Tom and Karen Mercer answered that question. They answered it at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning, with their daughter choosing the truth. Every single time, without exception. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think Tom and Karen Mercer did right. Tell us what you think Petra deserves. Tell us what you think Lena will carry with her into the life she is still building. And tell us where you are watching from tonight. This community reaches every time zone and every kind of story, and we want to hear yours. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.